climate change is not a single one-time issue, and it is not the current generation is going to face impact. It's the next generation, the next generation.
Why the need to protect the environment is so important, because at the end of the day, environment is a limited resource and our economy functions on a healthy environment as well. If we don't have a healthy environment, then we can't have healthy economy. Many different climate issues in Singapore that we need to focus on. One of them being energy and one of them being waste. Like Singapore it doesn't have its own hinterland, its own energy, natural resources. Majority of the energy we get today is from natural gas, I think about 95%. And so Singapore is now looking to diversify away from this fossil fuel gas. How can we use more renewable energy instead, and considering also that we don't have a lot of renewable energy sources, and also considering that some of the renewable energy that we get may not necessarily come from the best sources. Like for example, hydropower has been associated with displacement of local communities, so I think it's something that we also should look into and also try to create our policies that are social, that ensure a just transition, not just in a local sense but also in a regional sense. And on your second question on how it's related to the climate, energy, when we burn like fossil fuels, like natural gas, there's a lot of methane that may be released into the environment, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Also, the process of extracting the natural gas also is not particularly super environmentally friendly as well. And on how waste is related to the climate, the byproducts of burning the waste is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Like for example, we burn a lot of plastics, for example, and plastics contain a lot of carbon in them.
I guess you can look at it in two ways. One is the local impact and one is the regional impact. So go with the local one first. A very prominent one is sea level rise. So Singapore is a low-lying, small island state, and that means Singapore is exceptionally vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise in particular. Flooding was actually quite common in Singapore when there's like rainy season. And what happens right now with climate change is that the precipitation is going to increase. We have more seasonal rainfall. So we are already experiencing the increased rainfall, and that is going to lead to sea level rise. By the end of the century, the sea level rise could go as high as 2 meters or even above. That's like me entirely underwater, and that's going to flood most of the infrastructures. Apart from that heat island effect, because Singapore is a highly urbanized country, and what happens when you have a lot of high-rise buildings is that these buildings trap heat. This is going to increase the urban, especially daytime temperature of the city, and this is going to decrease the livability, and it's going to impact those populations that do not have access to air conditioning, like your migrant workers, construction workers. All these people that do not have access to air conditioning, they are going to face a lot of health risk.
How can we ensure that our climate policies are beneficial to Singapore, beneficial to the economy, which is not a bad thing, but at the same time, like it may not sustainability at the end of the day may not always be the most like economically costly in some sense. Do we want to prioritize GDP and economic productivity at all costs, or do we also prioritize like other needs and other indicators, like for example health, mental well-being, environmental sustainability, social and economic inequality, and so on.
So those are the two major climate impacts locally. Regionally, flooding is going to affect the energy and food security that Singapore very much rely on. So most of Singapore's food actually comes from regional imports, and we know climate change is going to cause flooding and extreme weather events in a lot of food producing countries nearby. And when that happens, where's Singapore going to get our food from? Energy security as well. As I mentioned just now, if Singapore is going to increasingly rely on renewable energy from the region, solar, hydropower, all these shifts in climate patterns is going to affect our energy security. So if we're going to reduce emission by switching to solar power, how are we going to deal with that at the same time?
So ICA stands for Singapore Youth for Climate Action, and we are a climate advocacy organization. Our aim is to meaningfully engage youths in climate action. So we do this through education and empowerment. So on the education side, we hold like climate policy workshops where they are very open and accessible for anyone to engage in and to learn more about climate policy, whether it's a local climate policy or international climate policy. And we also do like short explainers sometimes on our social media about some of the agenda items in the international climate policy. So for example, what is loss and damage about, what is carbon trading and carbon credits about, what is Singapore's stance on it, how is Singapore affected by these policies, or how are we affecting these policies. I think through understanding all these, then we can thus empower people, because then we understand what are some of the gaps in our climate policy and what are some of the areas we need to work on.
Climate change is not a single one-time issue. It's an issue that's gonna last for decades, if not centuries. And it is not the current generation is gonna face the biggest impact of climate change. It's the next generation, the next generation. So there's a lot of intergenerational injustice that is already arising, and that's why we need to involve youths, because they are the future owners. In fact, they are already the owners of the country. So in Singapore, for example, the boys start serving national service since they're 18, even before they can vote. And so this tells us how important it is to give them the voice and ownership, especially in a democratic country, to have a voice in the future that they want. Of course, it makes sense to get youth involved as early as possible so that they in the future have the relevant experience, expertise to deal with the issues.
สำนักข่าว Today Make Tomorrow Today